Meine Damen und Herren, ich begrüße Sie sehr zum heutigen Abend. Ich begrüße natürlich besonders unsere beiden Protagonisten, Sieglinde Geisel und Mohammed Hanif. Sieglinde Geisel, zu leise? Lauter? Ich höre Sie gut. Sieglinde Geisel is a freelance literary critic. Freelance, meaning that reading for her is not a job, but a passion or a necessity. Some years ago, she founded an online journal for literary criticism, Magazin für Literatur und Zeitgenossenschaft, but this is the subtitle. The first title is Tell. I guess this is a reminder of the fact that Sieglinde Geisel is Swiss. One of her favorite critical devices consists in opening a book, any book, on one predetermined page, and this is page 99. And of course, of reading this one page carefully. This page 99 test is, of course, not meant to be a general recipe for literal criticism of any kind, but it has two, I think, interesting effects. First, working on only one page, the critic loses his lead over the ordinary reader. His or her criticism becomes accountable and risky. Second, with only one page, the attention inevitably becomes focused less on the narrated content than on the elements of style, on the form, and perhaps we shall get some example of this tonight. Mohammed Hanif, the fellows have come to know him, was born in Punjab, and his first language was Punjabi. As a teenager, he learned Urdu, which is the national language of Pakistan, mutually understandable with Hindi, the national language of India, and English. English, which gave him the access to literature. He joined the army when he was 16 and was trained as a fighter pilot. After graduating from the Air Force Academy, Mohammed left the army and started working as a journalist. In 1996, he became the director of the BBC Urdu service in London, where he lived for 12 years. In 2008, he published his first novel, A Case of Exploding Mangoes. The book offers, among other things, an inside view of the Pakistan military. It's obvious that Mohammed, during his training, got to know the army very well, but without the army getting to know him as well, which is easier to say than to achieve. The plot of the novel culminates in the airplane crash that killed Pakistan's then dictator Zia-ul-Haq. The causes of the crash had never been cleared up. The book was printed in India. I guess in Pakistan it would hardly have been possible. Nevertheless, Mohammed decided to leave his job in London and to move back to Pakistan. He published a second novel in 2011, Our Lady of Alice Bhatti. Both novels are malicious, deeply funny, disturbing, grotesque and realistic at the same time, and both very much about Pakistan. Being written in English, only a minority in Pakistan can read them. They have been widely read abroad, translated into many languages, but up to now, if I'm not mistaken, not into Urdu. I don't know. One has. Yeah, good. Mohammed has also written libretti for 2 operas, premiered in 2017, one and the other in January of this year, The Dictator's Wife, about Pervez Musharraf and his wife, and Bhutto about Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Prime Minister of Pakistan, executed in 1979, and about his daughter Benazir, assassinated in 2008. Pakistani politics, in its tendency to violence and tragic performance, seems to have a certain affinity to opera as a genre. Mohammed writes regularly opinion pieces for The Guardian and the New York Times, but he also writes in Urdu and appears in Pakistani television. His contributions are extremely competent. Like in the case of the army, he obviously knows very well what he's writing about. Outspokenly critical, sharp, and very often sarcastic. Reading them, one gets the impression that their author is not very much concerned with his own safety. If you allow me an expression that I have, I think, never used in this room, Mohammed Hanif is, last but not least, a very brave man. The floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? Am I loud enough now? Okay. Yeah, we have already heard the stations of Mohammed Hanif's life. It's a very extraordinary life for a writer. I don't think there are many writers who are also trained fighter pilots. And I would like to know more about the place where you came from and what you left behind, because obviously you have made a really great journey. How did it all begin?
I guess you are asking me about my life, personal life.
Yes, what's your background? Did you grow up amid books and middle-class life? Or?
No, I mean, sometimes you tell this story, and I was born in a village, in a sort of middle-class farming community where education and jobs and things like that were just considered for losers, because you had your own land and you had a good potato crop and you were like set for a couple of years. So, but we were sent off to school so that we could, sort of learn to read and write. And that's where I had my primary education. And then we were sent off to the city, which was only like a mile away. I don't know why it was called a city, because it was not very different from our village. And that's where we had our high school. So my family was a bit conservative, and I was growing up at a time when, sort of, you didn't have all these luxuries that we have now. So then I think I must have had an urge to, because it was, sort of a lovely, peaceful life. But for a teenager, I think that's not very exciting. So I mean, farming is kind of one of the most boring things one can do, because nothing much happens from morning till evening.
And it would have been expected from you that you would also take up farming from your parents?
Pretty much, that you'll kind of, learn to read and write, and until sort of you were some kind of genius and became like something on your own, then you might be allowed to get away. But that had never happened before. I mean, people had tried, So yeah, those were the kind of expectations, and I was very bold, and I wanted to have adventures like people do. And there weren't very many places to go, so I saw this ad in a newspaper, which was for Pakistan Air Force. Every year they recruit pilots. And I didn't know, nobody from our family, in fact from our entire village, had ever been in the army, so I had no idea what this was like. So I applied, and it's a pretty long process. Like, they do psychological assessments for a few days, and then they kind of, take you into a medical facility, and, sort of everything is checked. So apparently they found that I was the perfect man for the job. So I got the job, and I was only 16 and a half at that time. And I could ride a bicycle, but I had never kind of a motorbike or even a tractor, which kids my age in my village could do. But I wasn't kind of allowed to do that. So I ended up in the Air Force Academy, and as soon as I walked into those gates, I realized that this was not the freedom that I had been looking for in my life. Because life was a bit tough. So, but I sort of stayed on because I didn't really have any other options. I told my family, they were shocked, but they came to accept it, that okay, our son will join the army and will become like an officer, and became, sort of a thing of honor for them. So I couldn't kind of quite tell them that I worked so hard to convince them. Now, how do I? And it's actually not easy to run away because there are gates and guards with guns.
And
you can't just walk out.
You had to commit yourself for a lot of years? I mean, what was the reason
I
for the
had
army?
committed myself for 18 years.
Wow, when you were 16, more
I
than
was
your life.
16 and a half, so I thought I was wise. But I stuck around for about 7.5 years, and then I managed to leave.
How did you get the idea to become a journalist?
Oh, just randomly, because the military life actually does not prepare you for anything. I mean, it doesn't even prepare you to kind of, iron your own clothes, because an officer's life in Pakistan, I don't know about here, like you actually have your own personal batman who kind of makes sure that everything is ironed, your boots are polished, like, you get tea at the right time. So you're basically like a dysfunctional kind of, adult, which is like most men, I guess. But you can, sort of, you're trained, sort of, but not for anything that's kind of there in civilian lives. So while I was there, I was not good at anything that are supposed to be soldierly, like, sort of shooting and flying and kind of, kicking people's ass. I was quite bad at it. But it turned out that I was pretty okay at reading and writing. So I would spend a lot of time when you kind of wanted to run away from the parade square or something. You went and hid in the library, and that was the safest place.
You
because
had access to books. That's
yes, they used to have like the most kind of brilliant libraries. They had every book, and the nice thing was that nobody ever went there. I mean, because soldiers are not supposed to kind of go into a library and kind of spend time reading. So it was always empty. So whenever you could sneak in, you could just spend sort of an afternoon there. So I think I kind of got that reading and writing bug, which I probably didn't have when I went in. So I just started to write freelance for fashion magazines initially.
I have one question before.
I thought I had a great sense of style. And
he always compliments me when I wear something, I must say.
Yeah, so I used to do fashion writing, TV reviews, like film reviews, and in those days there was like sort of market for those kind of things. They would publish, like I remember once I had 12 articles in one magazine in 1 month. It was print, like so I practically, like TV reviews. Is this not working?
No.
It is working.
Maybe it should be higher up in your...
Okay, let's do that.
Exactly, looks better. Sounds better.
Now, is this better?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so
Yeah.
someone comes to rescue.
Thank you. If I button up my shirt, would it help?
Yes, probably.
Or would I just become another person? Because that can happen, you know. Yeah.
Forget about fashion.
Yes, yeah. So, sorry, you
But
were
I
saying.
wonder, I mean, all your education in terms of literature is autodidactic. You didn't, I mean, people like me went to the university, not that I really learned much there that I can use now. I mean, Mr. Giuliani was so nice in his presentation with the page 99 stuff, and so that was all what I learned outside of university, or actually how to read I learned from people who were not professors. So maybe you didn't miss much, but how did you educate yourself in a
I mean, I don't think I ever bothered with that, because it was too much fun reading books that you had no idea about. So you went into kind of, you know, so they had like all the classics, they had all the contemporary books. They even had books which were banned in Pakistan for some funny reason. For example, Salman Rushdie was banned in Pakistan, but was there in the Air Force libraries. And I had no idea who Salman Rushdie was, because nobody ever taught us, and you didn't like have any access to any literary magazines or anything. So you just read randomly, and you had no idea if this was a literature, or if this was a thriller, or if this was like, you know, a pornographic novel. Everything was a story that you read. So, which I think was a sort of one way of reading. I do appreciate people who kind of go through a formal literary education. But since I didn't have those advantages, so I just read randomly things that I liked. And I think in a way I still do that. So,
So in a way, maybe reading was the adventure that you found at the army, not the fighter stuff.
yeah, although I mean, to a young man, that stuff should have been very exciting, and some of it was actually, but I wasn't very good at it. I mean, if I had been kind of, you know, sort of, and if I had had some ambition, because you can't be like, you know, sort of, you can't be a soldier, an officer, if you don't have the wish to command your fellow men. Because that's what kind of carries you forward. That's what wins you wars, or, you know, sort of at least keeps you in power in case of Pakistan. So I didn't. So I just found all of that in books.
So, but at first your journalism was still in Pakistan. What you just described, the fashion magazines and the film.
Yes. So I quickly then, after doing fashion magazine, because I mean I found out pretty soon that I didn't really have much of a sense of style, and I couldn't. There are so many ways that I could describe a pattern or like a model's looks. That was so I moved on to what is the so-called serious political type journalism. There was a magazine which had come out, and my sort of great late editor, Bhatti, she was editing it, and she was very brave and fearless, and it was like being run by a group of independent journalists, and all of them women. I was the only kind of token male reporter. There was one, but he hardly ever came to the office. So I think I got my reading training in the Air Force, and then my writing training at this magazine called Newsline, because she was very, very, she cared not just about, you know, sort of her mission in life was to kind of, you know, to create trouble, to kind of, you know, and her other mission in life was that you should get a sentence right. Like, you know, you can't get your commas wrong. So I think that helped at that stage in my life.
And then the BBC got note of you?
Yeah, no, I just recently got married, and Karachi was becoming a bit. It always goes through these cycles that after 5, 7, 8 years, you feel that you've either made too many friends or too many enemies, and sometimes you can't tell. So you want to get away for a bit and kind of throw them off your, and so we thought we'll go to London, live there for a couple of years, but as it happens with expats, before we knew it was a decade, and we were still kind of talking about returning to Pakistan.
And while you were living in London, you started writing this book?
Yes.
The book about Zia-ul-Haq's end.
Mm-hmm.
What made you write about Zia-ul-Haq while you were in London? When did you start? I mean, he died in 88, so... Oh, I'm so sorry.
Maybe they need to boost your volume from outside.
Yes.
Ja, können Sie mich hören, Johannes?
There's a man who just came in and...
Yes, exactly. He should try to get me. I'm so sorry. Shall I? Okay, I'll try again just to be louder. Ja, irgendwie funktioniert das nicht. Oder? Ja, aber es heißt, ich wäre nicht zu hören. Ah, okay. So I won't look at you, Mohammed. Sorry about that. So, I'm asking questions to the audience, but you know you're meant. So yeah, I asked him, he was in London when he was writing this book about Zia-ul-Haq, who died in 88, and I asked him what made him write about Zia-ul-Haq while he was living in London, and how came this book about?
So I think it's very common malaise. People who read too many books kind of get these delusions that I can write one too. And everybody thinks that there's a book within them. And as a famous writer said, sort of maybe that's true, but you also have a kidney inside you. You don't take it out and flash it to people, so just keep it there.
That's also how he writes his book. That's his style.
So I had these notions that I want to write a book. And what are you going to write about? Most people, sort of write about their own lives. And I've already told you my life story. That would make about 3 pages, and then we'll be done. So as a journalist, I had, because I was still in the Air Force when this man died, and he was we spent our youth under him. His face was permanently stuck on TV, and he'd been there for 10, 11 years, and we'd always assumed that he was never going to go away. And suddenly, one day he was gone. And not only he was gone, another 6, 7 top generals, the US ambassador to Pakistan, they all disappeared.
I think about 34 people died in that
34
plane crash.
people,
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, where were you when it happened? Do you remember how
I
you learned it?
was in the Air Force. I was at a secret base in Karachi. I'm not supposed to name it, but yeah, I was still in the Air Force, and we were this.
I mean, were you shocked?
We were shocked for about 10, 15 minutes. Then we were very happy. And then there was dancing on the streets and sort of, those kinds of things. But what struck me about the whole incident was that 5 years went past, 10 years went past, and nobody was interested in finding out who had bumped him off. It was quite clear that it was a sabotage. But no journalists, not the American establishment, who had lost one of their kind of ambassadors in it, not the army itself, which had kind of lost its entire command. So, and people's kind of attitude generally was sort of good riddance, let's get on with our lives, who cares who killed them. So I was, as a journalist, I tried a couple of times to kind of, to interview people who were around there at that time, like some Americans who were, and very soon I realized that there was no way that I was going to find out the truth. That was not going to happen if I spent my entire life.
Why?
Because everybody had a stake in covering it up. Everybody.
Wow.
All the kind of, so...
10 years after still, or 15 years after?
Yes, yeah. So I was, as a journalist, I was frustrated. But as a writer, I said, wait a minute. Here's like a murder mystery, which nobody is solved, but nobody is interested in solving. So I then just came up with this, said, what if somebody was to raise their hand and say, I did it? Like, what happens then, or what might have happened to that person? So it started as a kind of an extended joke, I think, which went a bit
and also because it was like a necessity, what you couldn't do with journalism, you switched to the novel?
Yes, also then that base need to write a novel, which, sort of one couldn't get rid of. Like, I've been thinking about writing a novel, and that need was there, but didn't really have a story to tell, or sort of. So I think, yes, you could say that it was like a frustrated journalist's revenge, or like a failing novelist's kind of, trick to do this. So, or maybe a bit of both.
Yeah, how good that you couldn't find out who killed him, because otherwise we wouldn't have this novel. And I think we should now hear a passage from the novel. I asked Mohammed to read this because it really blew my mind when I read that. And journalism actually tells us, or should tell us, what happened, how it was. And literature tells us what could have been. And this passage really goes like the way between those two things. So I'll take a seat and let you work.
Okay. So this is, so General Zia wasn't the first military dictator that we had, and he wasn't the last. So there's almost a set pattern to these things, that they throw away the government and then they kind of, sort of convene, the generals sit and talk. So this is the day after the coup has happened. So there's a meeting taking place. It's a description of that meeting. In the first meeting after General Zia's coup, 8 generals, including the head of the Navy and the Air Force, sat around a table in the conference room of General Headquarters. Keeping in mind the historic nature of the session, the orderlies had sprayed rose-scented air fresheners generously, and the room smelled like a freshly sealed coffin. The Adjutant General, General Beg, a 2-star general given to unpredictable fits of sneezing, sat in a corner with a white handkerchief over his nose, ready to record every word that was uttered in the conference. A copy of the agenda lay before each of them in a green leather folder, embossed with golden cross swords, cradling a thin new moon. General Zia noticed that although all 8 of them stood up and saluted, they all sat down without waiting for him to take his chair first. They shifted in their seats, and before he could declare the meeting open, the naval chief said, "I want to bring it on record that I was informed about the coup when it was already underway." The Adjutant General's pressed sneeze distracted everyone for a moment, and General Zia found the opening he badly needed. He fixed the naval chief with a benevolent stare and spoke in a pleading voice. "Of course we'll hear your protest, and of course we'll need your guidance in what we have set out to do. But since we are all meeting for the first time after we were able to save our country without spilling a single drop of blood, should we not start the meeting with a recitation from the Quran? May Allah guide us in all our endeavors." They shifted in their seats, not knowing how to deal with this. They were all Muslims, and they all knew that the chief had a religious bent. Some of them even called him the mullah when talking on secure telephone lines. But a meeting was a meeting, and mixing religion with the business of running the country was a concept not comprehensible to them. A quarter of a century of military training had prepared them for many tasks. They could make toasts in 5 different languages. They could march in step and hold joint military exercises with the best armies in the world. If they chose to shed their uniform, they could take up diplomatic careers or run universities. But all their staff and command courses and all their survival skills were not enough. They didn't know how to say no to an offer of a recitation from the Quran from their own chief. They shifted some more in their seats. They breathed in some more rose-scented air. General Zia took out a slim, magenta-colored copy of the Quran from his folder, put on his reading glasses, and started to recite. All the commanders looked down respectfully and listened in silence. Some put their hands in their laps, wondering whether the time had come for them to face the consequences of their godless ways. The recitation didn't last more than 3 minutes. General Zia's voice was croaky, but something about reading the Quran aloud makes even the most toneless voice sound bearable. He finished the recitation and handed the Quran to General on his left. Since General Akhtar speaks very good English, I'll ask him to read out the translation for those of us who don't understand Arabic. Utter nonsense, the naval chief thought. None of us understands Arabic. General Akhtar started reading haltingly. I begin in the name of God, the holiest, the most merciful. General Zia stared at him without blinking as the translation was read out. As soon as he finished, General Zia grabbed the copy from him and held it up to his generals. What do you think it says here in this part that I just recited? There was a moment's silence. General Beg sniveled behind his handkerchief. Come on, speak up. General Zia raised his voice. Then he obeyed his own command. In Arabic, it says, in the name of Allah. It doesn't say in the name of God. It doesn't say in the name of gods. It doesn't say in the name of some nameless deity. It says in the name of Allah. He left a dramatic pause. Let me remind my brothers here that the very first thing that a non-Muslim has to say to become a Muslim, the very first article of faith that every believer has to profess is, there is no God but. He paused again and looked around the table, expecting them to complete the first kalima. No one spoke up. He repeated, there is no God but Allah, they all murmured, like school children unsure if they were being asked a trick question. Yes, General Zia brought down his fist on the table. My dear generals, let's get one thing clear before we hear your protests and your suggestions. There is no God but Allah. And since Allah himself says there is no God, let's abolish the word. Let's stop pretending God is Allah. It's a Western construct, an easy way to confuse who is the creator and who the destroyer. We respect all religions, especially the religions of Christianity and Judaism. But do we want to become like them? Christians call Jesus the Son of God. Are we to understand that some God came down while Mary was fast asleep, and here he made a circle with the thumb and forefingers of his left hand and poked at it with the middle finger of his right hand? Jews are pretty close to calling Moses their God. You might think that it's all the same to our people. God, Allah, same difference. He mimicked the clipped English accent many of his generals preferred. But who should be telling them that we believe in Allah and not in any other God? Didn't Allah choose us to clear up this confusion? Then, as an afterthought, he appealed to the patriotism of his fellow generals. Even Hindus call their 6-armed monsters their gods. Isn't that a reason enough to stay away from this word? And if any of you have any concerns that people will not appreciate the difference between God and Allah, I suggest we leave it to Allah. The complete silence that followed his short speech satisfied General Zia. Can we now hear the naval chief's protest? The naval chief, still reeling from the lecture about God's nomenclature, suddenly felt very small. He was worrying about a breach in protocol when the whole nation was calling God by all sorts of wrong names. The generals who had called General Zia a mullah behind his back felt ashamed at having underestimated him. Not only was he a mullah, he was a mullah whose understanding of religion didn't go beyond parroting what he had heard from the next mullah. A mullah without a beard, a mullah in a 4-star general's uniform, a mullah with the instincts of a corrupt tax inspector. The others sat stunned around the table, still trying to comprehend what they had just heard. If General Zia could have read their minds, this is what he would have read. What did they teach him at Sandhurst? A country that thinks it was created by God has finally found what it deserves. A blabbering idiot who thinks he has been chosen by Allah to clear his name. He really makes sense. How come I didn't think of it before? Who is he going to appoint his deputy? Am I in an army commander's meeting or a village mosque? I am going to prohibit the word God at home. Who would have thought there was a theocratic genius in that uniform? Can we get on with the agenda? We've just toppled an elected bloody government. How the hell are we going to run this country? Is Allah going to come down and patrol the bloody streets? The only person who voiced his thoughts was General Akhtar, a former middleweight boxer, a clean-shaven man of tribal origins, who was packed with so much soldierly dignity that he could have been born in any country on any of the 5 continents, and he still would have become a general. His ability to carry himself with martial grace and his talent for sucking up to his superiors was so legendary that, according to a joke popular in the trenches, he could wipe out a whole enemy unit by kissing their asses. The other generals stopped thinking and moved forward in their chairs to listen to General Akhtar. By Allah's grace, you have brought this country back from the edge of destruction. By Allah's mercy, you have saved this country when the politicians were about to push it over the edge of a precipice. I want to thank, he stopped himself as he was about to thank God. He folded his boxer's hands respectfully on the green folder. I want to thank Allah and our visionary chief of staff, to whom Allah has given the wisdom to take the right decision at the right time. He looked around the table before continuing. I also want to thank our professional commanders sitting around this table who carried out the coup on the orders of our chief in such an orderly manner that not a single bullet had to be fired, not a single drop of blood had to be shed. The power balance in the room suddenly shifted, and the 8 men, despite their different levels of affiliation to religion, diverse tastes in whiskey and women, and various English accents, reached the same conclusion. General Akhtar had beaten them to it. They should have spoken these words. The rose-scented air in the meeting room suddenly felt stale. General Beg wiped his nose and put his handkerchief back in his pocket. The conference moved on to the agenda, to the urgent matters of securing the country's borders, finding legal cover for the coup, and enlisting politicians who could be trusted to support the military regime. General Zia hinted at the nice things to come. I need governors for the provinces. I need ministers to run the ministries. Who can I count on except the professionals gathered around this table? They got up and left the room reassured, but none forgot their chief's message. In the next 11 years, many of these generals would retire. Some would go on to govern provinces. Others would be replaced by their juniors. 2 things that weren't even in the agenda survived every upheaval that followed. General Akhtar remained a general until the time he died, and all God's names were slowly deleted from the national memory as if a wind had swept the land and blown them away. Innocuous, intimate names, Persian Khuda, which had always been handy for ghazal poets as it rhymed with most of the operative verbs, Rab, which poor people invoked in their hours of distress, Maula, which Sufis shouted in their hashish sessions. Allah had given himself 99 names. His people had improvised many more. But all these names slowly started to disappear from official stationery, from Friday sermons, from newspaper editorials, from mothers' prayers, from greeting cards, from official memos, from the lips of television quiz show hosts, from children's storybooks, from lovers' songs, from court orders, from telephone operators' greetings, from habeas corpus applications, from inter-school debating competitions, from road inauguration speeches, from memorial services, from cricket players' curses, even from beggars begging please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's obvious why Mohammed Hanif didn't want to just stay a journalist, but have more freedom in writing in his prose. When I read this conference of the generals, I felt really like I was there. And there's such a thing as called new journalism, which employs such techniques that you describe something as if you have been an eyewitness, though obviously you were not. And that's what you do here too. So I wonder, how could you know how this could have been? Because obviously you don't know how it was, or do you?
No, of course I don't know, and I kind of appreciate new journalism, but I'm quite old-fashioned when it comes to journalism. Otherwise, like most of fiction these days, you can read in newspapers. That's all there for us to see. No, of course I made it all up. I mean, you know, sort of because when these kind of conferences happen, they happen quite often, every couple of months, over matters of national importance. And all you get is 3 to 4 lines of a press release that these commanders met, they discussed the matters of national security, and they agreed to keep on doing whatever the fuck they're doing. Basically, it says that. There's never been any detail, there's never been any inside account. There's hardly ever retired journal would dare write about that what went on in a commander's meeting, because these, after all, they write about one thing. These are matters of international security. So they might want to leak something sometimes, but no, never. So yeah, it's made up.
And you didn't have any experience of similar kinds of conferences during your military career or your military stay?
I was very junior. I was learning to fly, and the atmosphere there is quite different. You have an instructor who is trying to make you into a fighter. So my experience of national security was limited to either my officer's mess or the cockpit of my aircraft. It was a bit harsh because in those days they were allowed to beat you up, like physically. If you made a mistake, you're learning to fly, they could hit you. And my instructor pilot also happened to be the champion of the Air Force boxing that year. So I could never anticipate his sort of his punch coming. So that was my experience of national security. We were never kind of subjected to these kinds of meetings.
But you imagine not just only the kind of convention and the thoughts that those people have, but also the entrance of Islam into politics in Pakistan in a way.
I mean, I don't know. I guess we saw it, and because we were in the Air Force, so you could read like all the novels in the world, but they don't really tell you what's happening, like, you know, outside of the cantonment. So it was only later when I left, I realized that there was a process, because when we joined, every weekend you will still have like a pop band playing, and we kind of, sort of in our bows and ties pretending to toast from like, orange juice. And so you had like all those old bad colonial ways. You were, the army was quite westernized. It still is, I think. But then these things are Commandant, for example. So he was a man of the world. He would go around like in these snazzy suits, and sort of will be there in the first seat whenever we had like sort of movie evenings or bands coming to play. And then suddenly, when these changes came, you'll have like a 2-hour-long Quran lecture in the morning every Friday, and the Commandant himself would insist that he will deliver it. So there were people kind of who were shifting their prayers became compulsory, for example, around that time. Before that, it was like all your kind of personal stuff you kept it to. So it wasn't institutionalized. So during that time, it had just started to happen. So I think that those memories must have stayed in my head.
How deep did this Islamization of life go? I mean, what you just now described is it's a top-down thing, I mean, did it stay top or did it really get down to the people?
I think that's a difficult one to answer. There are too many historians in this room, so I don't want to theorize anything. But I'm sure the process must have gone on for a very long time. And so we had a fertile ground that somebody like him could come along and say that all of you are going to pray 5 times a day. Now, as a Muslim, who's going to raise their hand and say, fuck off, especially to a military dictator? I mean, that it doesn't work like that. So it was top down, but there were very many people who didn't have, any, who didn't have, any rationale to say no or to stand up to it. And people who did came to, a lot of them, came to a very bad end. And then there were clever ones, like some of my friends who would go to the mosque at the prayer time, sign their names, and then, disappear off to somewhere else. So I think most people found these kind of practical solutions to these problems.
So you didn't find out who was the saboteur who made that plane crash, and you solved the problem in that way that you invent like about 6 people who were complotting independently. Everybody wanted to kill him, apparently.
It seemed like it, especially because why would you? I mean, in most societies, in South Asia especially, if somebody, even if your worst enemy dies, you kind of go quiet for a moment. You don't celebrate. I mean, that's the thing. That's what we were taught since we were children. So how come people were dancing on the streets, and how come young officers were pooling their money to buy bottles of black label whiskey to celebrate? So it was quite an eye opener that that the guy was, because I was still in the Air Force, so I hardly knew any civilians, so I had no idea what people thought of him outside of the cantonments. For us, he was still he was a bit eccentric, but he was still the chief. You couldn't go out and say anything openly against him. Yeah. So suddenly, somebody disappears, and then everybody says, "Oh, life begins now," type moment. For the entire country, I would say, for most of the country. So, and then the fact that nobody, his son and some other general's sons, they were in government repeatedly on very high posts, and they never made any serious effort. So you can imagine where your own family doesn't want to know who killed you. There must be like something, something slightly.
And still, when you try to research this, too many people had something at stake, as that you could have found out something. So I wonder, what was the reaction in Pakistan when your book came out? Was it kind of, did you break a taboo with this? Fantasizing about who killed him?
I think, yeah, I mean, fantasies generally kind of, I don't want to claim that, but yes, in a way that it broke a taboo that I fictionalized it, and B, I didn't change the names. I kept some of the main characters' real names. So some of my journalist friends who read the manuscript, and they were like, "What the hell are you thinking?" But I think every book, when it comes out, has a context. So in Pakistan those days, things were so bad that they couldn't really care about a little book kind of coming along. So because they had huge serious things to deal with. So the book that way kind of, you could say that it went under the radar. I moved to Pakistan soon after that. I did readings in all big cities. It's taught in universities, and even in some high schools. Got really kind of lovely reviews. So no, it didn't have the kind of backlash. But you mentioned about the translation. So a friend of mine translated in Urdu like 2 years ago, and it's been sitting. It was sitting with a publisher. So the cover was ready. It was almost ready to go to the press. So I went and asked him, what's the delay? He said, I'm still consulting some serious editorial type people. And I said, what are you consulting about? Like that it's could be dangerous. But I said, the book has been around for almost 8-9 years. I mean, nobody's ever said me anything. Nobody's publicly said anything against me. But he's a I guess he knows those people more than I do. He said sometimes these people get the joke like 10 years later. So maybe it's fine till it stays in English, but it comes out in Urdu, I don't know, suddenly. So I've taken it away from him, and there's another woman publisher in Karachi who's completely willing to, so it'll come out in the next couple of months.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you moved back to Karachi in 2008, I think?
Yes, yeah.
Why did you do that?
Oh, I was homesick. Yeah, I was homesick. And I had written a sort of a, moderately successful book. And this is what all immigrants want. They want to go back and say, look, I've made it. No. But before that, I was really homesick, and I thought about it a lot in London. And before that, as a young person, I had gone to the States for a few months, and I would meet up these people who'd stayed there for a very long time, and we'd have lovely time. We'd kind of listen to old songs and talk about our villages. And we thought, why don't you just if you miss some place so much, why don't you just go and live there? So our son was growing up. So it was like, being kind of, homesick, always promising your family and friends, oh, next year we're kind of coming back. That the whole immigrant thing, I think lots of people do that. And so we were also becoming a bit of a joke. People would say, oh, yeah, sure. So there was a time like the child was still kind of, at that age where you could move. So I think that was there's a number of kind of reasons.
And you're still happy with your choice, your decision?
Most days of the week, yeah. Sometimes kind of it can get very hot and humid, and sometimes a friend of yours is bumped off, and you kind of think about that.
Yeah, the people leaving Pakistan and begging for asylum here because they say it's just too dangerous to live there.
I think I really don't know what's the answer to that is. It can be, but as I said, some days, most days it's okay, and you duck and hide and you pretend that you're not there, or you pretend that you're not scared. Or you shut up for a while, I guess. That's because I'm not really a member of any political party or a militia. So the only thing that can get me into trouble is like writing or speaking. So, it's sometimes it's good to take a break. No?
Yeah, which brings us to the next book. There is a saying that even if literature talks about unhappy things or unhappiness, it makes you happy when you read it. That's a paradox. And I think you deal with it that you write also here. We haven't touched about, you have really to read it yourself. I mean, we learn a lot of things about what a violent country this also is. And Our Lady of Bhatti is dealing with the issue of women in Pakistan. And you don't make us happy when reading unhappy things, but you make us laugh. So is humor for you a weapon?
I don't. I mean, it's a very sad weapon. If that's the only weapon that I've got, it doesn't. It can't kind of really. It might kind of it might kind of make you laugh in a single moment, but it's not something that you can fight. People say that it's the weapon of the weak, and this is what people can do. But I find it quite sad and pathetic that you've got an army of 7 lakhs, and I've got a bad joke. I mean, there's no comparison. That's not going to work. It's not going to change anything. I guess this is just something that I've picked up as you talked about my literary education in the beginning, but a lot of my education about how to tell a story or how to depict a situation has also come from our oral tradition, where people kind of sit in the street corner and kind of describe things that they have, what has happened, and their take on them, their so-called political analysis, or their way of looking at history, their way of looking at structures, their way of looking at people. So I think that comes from there, because it's probably their weapon, and I kind of sometimes borrow it from them, because even in the most miserable of times, people do find a way of describing which kind of makes you laugh, even if it for momentarily. So I think it's come from hanging out with too many people who are kind of who may not be who may never have read any book, for that matter. Most of my friends don't read, bless them. But they have lives, and they have experiences, and they have their ideas about the world we live in. So I think I've I've picked it up from them.
So humor is more like a survival skill.
Again, I would say it's not much of a skill. It can't take you very far. You can't fight cancer with it. You can't fight a military dictator with it. But yes, sometimes you can breathe, easy, and that too for a few moments, and that probably kind of helps you to live another day. So yes, I guess that is survival. Yeah.
Because the main character here is a woman. This is, I guess, really a fictional character, not somebody who actually exists.
Yeah. I mean, no, this character doesn't exist in real life, no.
Yeah, she's a nurse, a Christian nurse. What made you come up with this character? It's quite an unusual idea. And there are not so many Christians in Pakistan. It's like 1.5% or something, I read.
Yeah, I guess 2.5.
So she is a minority also from religion, not just in her.
Yeah, I think again, I think for me more than one thing kind of happens for me to start on something. And I think one thing that immediately struck me when I moved back to Pakistan was, as a journalist, you read. We pick up a stack of newspapers every morning, and my kind of instinct is usually to go for the metro news or the local news, that what's happened in the city, wherever I am. And with some alarming regularity, I started to notice that every day in the local pages, you will find news about a woman who's been killed in some quite a horrible way, mostly by somebody close to her, within the family. At first I thought maybe it's Pakistan is going through a bad month, but I kept at it week after week after week after week. And trust me, there was not a single day, and sometimes, I think twice or thrice in Pakistan, newspapers are not published, so there's a newspaper holiday. So I would pick up, the newspaper when it came out after the holiday, and surely there would be 2 or 3, sometimes even more. So I was a bit struck by this fact that something happens with such regularity. But that's not how or why I started to write. I had about 20 years before I wrote this book, my mother was terminally ill. She was in a hospital, and I was spending all my time. In fact, I was living in the hospital with her for a couple of months. And hospitals, like, sort of one shouldn't wish it upon anybody, but they're kind of, in a way, fascinating places. That, sort of they work around the clock. Somebody's being born, somebody's dying, somebody's in pain, somebody's like, and then there are all these relatives. So I was just spending all this time there in my mother's room, and I knew that she was dying. So years later, when I would try to remember her face in those days, I couldn't remember her. But what I would remember is that I remember like a nurse walking into the room like at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. and kind of fiddling with her, sort of with her things, like, sort of if she was her IV or giving her her medicine. So I kind of, those images were very kind of, those images had stayed with me, and I was quite, sort of impressed by the fact that somebody who's like not being supervised, who's kind of, very poorly paid, is working so hard and so much dignity and so much compassion when there's nobody to kind of, look at her, how you treat a person who's dying. I mean, sort of what's the point of being decent to somebody who's dying? I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. But I was quite fascinated by that whole, that work. So I think somehow I was, for months, I just had this image of this nurse, sort of taking care of an old woman. And when I was growing up, the nursing profession in Pakistan was dominated by Christian women. I mean, now it's a very competitive profession. There are people from, like, there are men and women, people from all faiths. But at that time, it's predominantly Christian women. So friends would ask me, like, what are you writing about these days? And I'm writing about a nurse. Where is she from? Like, what does she do? It's like she hasn't gone out of the room for ages. So I think rest of the stuff, her being a Christian, was almost like natural kind of extension, that if she wasn't from that period, it would end up, she would end up being a Christian. So that is kind of the rough beginnings or kind of random thoughts that were going through my head when I started to write this.
Yeah, you transfer what you just said about what made you write about women also to her. It says, because she is in the A&E, so the accidents and emergency section working, and not a single day when she didn't see a woman shot or hacked, strangled or suffocated, poisoned or burned, hanged or buried alive. So that's also one of the stylistic devices that you use a lot, the listing things that become very graphic when you really imagine what's happening. So we will now meet Alice, and we had a misunderstanding. That's why I'm going to read this passage, but I have a slight suspicion that this passage is not very nice for a man to read, so maybe it starts a nightmare for the woman, and then it ends with the ultimate nightmare for a man. I mean, you can have a seat if you want to enjoy it and have something to drink too.
Yeah, no, I have
we forgot about. You have yours? Okay. So. We'll follow up with a reading by Mohammed, so I won't take up too much time. The situation is this, that a black car with no license plate, it just says Desert Devil on the license plate, comes up with 4 men in black attire, and it's clear they are very rich and also dangerous, and their mother is dying in the hospital. And Alice has to be with them. And then after a few preliminaries where they kind of treat her like also an attendant, she has to bring them cake and so, the younger one clears his throat and says, "Can we have some cake, please?" Comes only here. Alice is amused at the fact that these people can't tell the difference between a nurse and their personal maid. Old families treat everyone like a servant. She puts on a smile, slices a thick wedge, puts it on a plate and plonks it on the table. As she turns to go, Junior stops her. "Pick up a card, please," they're playing cards. Alice hesitates for a moment, then bends down and picks up a card from the deck. In that instance, she can feel Junior's gaze piercing through to her cleavage. She hands him the card, and in turn he picks up a 1,000 rupee note from the table and waves it in front of her. Here, you have won. Alice doesn't mind accepting little gifts from her patients and their carers, but nobody has ever offered her a 1,000 rupee note. I'm not allowed to play cards while on duty, she says, and turns to go back to her seat. Then she looks back and says, but thank you. She doesn't want to offend them. She sits on the chair and is wondering if she should ask them to change the channel when Junior points towards the TV and asks, okay if I turn up the volume? Alice gives a confused nod. He gets up, finds the remote, and turns up the volume. Junior comes and stands close to Alice, so close that his crotch is practically in her face. The smell of sweet perfume is so overwhelming that she has to hold her breath in order to stop herself from sneezing. She tries to stand up. He pins her down with one hand and pulls out a revolver from under his shirt, then stands there with a blank face as if he has forgotten what he was planning to do. Suck, he says in a low voice, as if asking for another slice of cake, waving his revolver towards his crotch. Great scene, huh? Alice Bhatti realizes that all her struggles and dreams will die in this VIP room. She wonders if Sister Hina Alvi or Dr. Pereira know anything about this family tradition. She fears that if she resists, she'll end up back in the Borstal, which is a junior detention facility where she has been for 18 months. This time for life, probably. What? She says, still not quite able to believe the suggestion. His shalwar is around his ankles now, and a flaccid piece of cold meat grazes her cheek. She feels a wave of nausea rising from the pit of her stomach and clenches her throat muscles. She doesn't want to throw up in front of a patient. The barrel of the pistol hits her face and a bit of vomit spurts out of her mouth. Do you really have to? Senior speaks in an exhausted voice from his chair. This gives Junior another idea, and he says to Senior, I can't, not in front of you. Okay, I'll go for a walk, Senior says in a voice full of protective concern. But for God's sake, don't wake up Cos. That's the mother who is dying. As the door clicks shut, Alice is slapped again, hard. She still thinks she hasn't done anything to deserve this, but she has made up her mind to go through with it. There is, however, nothing to suck at. Her tormentor is still flaccid. He seems intent on doing something that his body has no desire to do. With her eyes shut, Alice reaches out, takes it in her left hand, and pumps her fist a few times. As soon as it stiffens, Junior's hand gripping her shoulder goes limp, as if the rush of blood in his groin has made him weak and lightheaded. With one hand still on his penis, Alice reaches with the other into her coat pocket and only looks up when she hears him scream. She is careful and steps out of the way of the tiny shower of blood that has erupted from his penis. Junior tries to straighten his revolver first, then drops it on the floor and begins to weep. Sister Alice puts the razor blade in the fold of a paper napkin, then puts it in a little plastic bag, seals it, and chucks it in the waste bin. Go to accidents, and no need to be shy. They get lots of this sort of things during their night shift. Before leaving the room, she turns around and says, and stop screaming. You'll wake Begum Kas, the mother who's dying. So, now. Shall we just add your reading now? Because it's just the phone, it's 10 after. Okay. Already? Okay, so we'll skip your reading?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
It's all right.
It's
Okay.
quite long.
Okay. Yeah, you really have to read the books for yourself. What comes now is also very funny. It's also very darkly funny in a way. So, yeah. Shall we open up already?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. We would like to invite you to join the conversation if you have any comments or questions, because we have been talking now so long.